Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Over the last several months, I've worked my way through many of the philosophical arguments for God, and why I find them unconvincing. I think today's video will be about the final argument, at least out of those that I hear on a regular basis. It's one that I've struggled to put into words the problem that I have with it. That's not to say that I find it at all convincing, but I do find it difficult to pin down. Even though my intuition has always been that I find it patently absurd and intuitively wrong, without a specific problem with it, I've generally just avoided it. But for the sake of the theists who use it to entrench themselves in their faith, I need to address it. And for the sake of making a comprehensive rebuttal playlist to theist arguments, I need to address it. Of course, I'm talking about the ontological argument. So I sat down and put into words the problems I have with it, until finally I had a response I was happy with, and this is that result. As with all arguments, there are subtle variations, but in general it first defines God as a maximally great being, and then goes something like this. Premise 1, it is possible that God exists. Premise 2, if it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3, if God exists in some possible worlds, then he exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4, if God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. Premise 5, if God exists in the actual world, then God exists. The first thing I've always struggled with in this argument is the vagueness of the language, which doesn't entirely rebut the argument, but it does make it appear more disingenuous. For example, what does it mean for God to exist in a possible world? Possible worlds themselves are just conceptual, and saying that something exists in a possible world is just another way of saying that we can conceive of its existence. We don't have any confirmation that these other worlds exist in any real sense. Saying that God exists in some possible worlds isn't a claim that God exists on some plane of reality, merely that he exists as a coherent concept within my mind. But the ontological argument treats that concept as something which exists as its own independent entity. It treats the idea as an actual being which can have properties at all, in particular the great-making ones. It treats the possible worlds as ones which actually exist and which can contain gods. This false equivocation is not good philosophy. It's a way to blur the line between internal conception and external reality. It's philosophical sleight of hand. It masquerades wish fulfillment as logical reasoning to help believers feel justified in believing that God is too good not to be true. But just because we can hold a concept in our head does not mean that such a concept must correspond to reality, no matter how great the idea is. Another vague word is great. It's such a subjective term. Why would it have any metaphysical relevance at all? What does it mean to be a maximally great being, or for a property to be a great-making property? What does it mean to say that God is that which nothing greater than could be conceived? As conceived by who? If greatest being just referred to the greatest out of those things which exist, then I would have no problem with accepting this thing's existence. But in that case, I'd still expect it to be something natural, and that which is the greatest by one standard wouldn't necessarily be the same being as that which is the greatest by a different standard. But all the divine qualities, all the omnis, wouldn't follow because those are based on being the properties of the greatest thing conceivable. But because maximally great being does refer in Anselm's argument to the greatest which can be conceived, he is introducing something which caused God in the form of whatever existed to conceive of him. If anything, this subjectivity of definition would appear to make God contingent on some conceiver, and therefore not a necessary being. And even if greatness does have some objective meaning, defending premise 1 on the basis that existence is greater than non-existence still doesn't make sense. Existence is not a property which things do or don't have. Things which don't exist have no properties, and things that do exist do have properties, such as greatness. But trying to compare the greatness of something which exists to the greatness of something which doesn't exist isn't a comparison that makes sense, because things which don't exist don't have greatness. To give a math analogy, it's a bit like if the greatness of something were a number, so something very great would have a big number and something not so great would have a small number. Just like you can say 1 is bigger than 0, you can say something great is greater than something not so great. But in the same way you can't say that 1 is bigger than undefined, neither can you say that something which exists is greater than something which doesn't. The non-existent thing doesn't have a greatness to be compared against. Anselm didn't choose maximal greatness as the defining property of God because it was something he deeply understood about reality, something which led him to belief in God. No, he started with his conclusion that God exists and then worked backwards to piece together an argument that made it look like the conclusion was valid. To be clear, I'm not saying it's a red flag that he had an idea and then worked to show it was true. Such is the nature of searching for truths, and even my own argument device started by trying to put into words the doubts I felt about God's existence. But the difference is that I didn't start with my conclusion. I was an agnostic and genuinely quite surprised when I realized that I had steelman my doubts to no longer be mere doubts, but an actual argument against God. It wasn't until I had completed the argument that I realized I had a compelling reason to believe God didn't exist and started considering myself a Gnostic atheist. And sure, as the originator, I have some bias towards this argument. But Anselm's argument was forged in far more bias than that. He was raised in a Christian community and felt called to be a monk from a young age. He had long since accepted Christ by the time he became a Benedictine monk in his late 20s, and it wasn't until he was 45, nearly 20 years later, that he published his Ontological Argument. That is the red flag that should give you doubt. This argument was never the reason that convinced Anselm to believe in God, and if it wasn't good enough for him, why should it be good enough for anyone? So far we have some suspiciously slippery language and a massive red flag about the origin of the argument. And while these issues do weaken the ontological argument, I don't think either one defeats it entirely. Anselm's motivations aren't directly applicable to the accuracy of the argument he presented, and I can believe that maybe I'm just missing something in the intent of the language. Luckily, I've saved my best rebuttal for last. Let's start by reminding ourselves of the question that the argument is trying to answer. Does God exist? Two options are on the table. Either he does or he doesn't. Anselm is trying to demonstrate that it is in fact the case that he does, or at least that it is illogical to believe that God doesn't exist. Even if I grant him all five premises, then the question reduces to, is it possible God exists? Once again, two options are on the table. Either it is possible or it's impossible. If it is possible, and we say that the ontological argument is completely flawless, then certainly God would exist. But if God's existence is impossible, then even as a true argument it wouldn't apply, and I think it's quite clear that God's non-existence must follow from this impossibility. And once again, Anselm bears a burden of proof here to demonstrate that it is in fact possible for such a being to exist. It is not on me or any non-believer to show why God's existence is impossible. It is on the one making the claim, on the believer who says that God exists, to demonstrate their claim. So what argument does Anselm make to say that God cannot be impossible, that God must be possible? Well, none. None whatsoever. All Anselm offers us is premise one. It is possible that God exists. No argument why, just a blatant assumption of the conclusion right at the start. It's well disguised and a lot less obvious than most, but ultimately it is a presuppositional argument, and therefore an invalid piece of reasoning. If I were to present an argument that opened with premise one, it is impossible God exists, you would rightly reject it. And that is a point that I think I can pin the ontological argument on. At the end of the day, it simply does not justify why God's non-existence can't be the case. It may sound to some like a logical justification for God, but in reality it's no more than a dance to misdirect you into thinking God has been demonstrated. Of course, if you want my advice on how best to avoid mind-dizzying arguments like this one in the first place, there's no better way than to go read a fucking book.